I used to think love had to look perfect, that a real father was supposed to be gentle, patient, and warm. Mine wasn't any of those things, or maybe I never gave him a chance to be. When I was 8, my mom remarried. She said, "Sweetheart, you'll like him. He's kind." But to me, kind was just another word adults used when they didn't want to explain what was really happening. His name was Tom Bennett, and from the first day he walked into our small house in Ohio, I decided I would never call him Dad. He wasn't my father. My father had left when I was 5. No explanation, no goodbye. Mom told me later he had a new family now. Those words stuck like a splinter under my skin, and so when Tom showed up, tall, quiet, wearing work, boots and an awkward smile, I hated him for trying to take a place that wasn't his. The first night he moved in, he tried to make spaghetti for dinner. The noodles were half raw and the sauce tasted like metal. Mom laughed. I didn't. I crossed my arms and said, "My real dad makes better spaghetti." Tom looked at me for a second, not angry, not hurt, just quiet. Then he said softly, "Guess I'll have to keep practicing." That made me angrier. How dare he act calm? How dare he think he could fit in? That night, I heard him fixing a squeaky cabinet in the kitchen after everyone had gone to bed. I remember the sound of the screwdriver, slow and steady. It annoyed me then. Later, I'd realize it was the sound of a man trying to make a home out of someone else's broken pieces. Years passed. He never pushed, never forced me to call him anything. He drove me to school every morning in his old blue truck. The seat smelled like pine and oil from his job at the auto shop. I used to sit as far from him as I could, staring out the window, pretending I didn't hear him when he asked, "You got your lunch?" He'd just smile and say, "I packed you an extra apple." You always forget. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me during my school plays or soccer games. He was always in the back, clapping too early or too loud. I hated that too. It made me feel guilty. And guilt was something I didn't want to feel for someone I swore I didn't care about. When I turned 16, things got worse. I wanted freedom. He wanted boundaries. 10 p.m. curfew, he said. "You're not my real dad," I snapped. He didn't shout. He didn't even look surprised. He just said, "You're right. But I care about you like I am." And then he walked away. I remember standing there, my throat tight, my chest aching, but pride, that ugly teenage pride, wouldn't let me say I was sorry. A few weeks later, Mom fell sick. A sudden infection that kept her in the hospital for days. I watched Tom move like a storm that wouldn't stop. He stayed up all night, balancing work, bills, and hospital visits. I pretended not to notice how red his eyes were from no sleep. One night, I found him sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. There were hospital papers scattered everywhere. He didn't hear me at first. Then he said quietly, "She's going to be okay." I nodded, pretending not to care, but the way his voice cracked, it scared me. He looked up, tired but calm. "You should sleep, kiddo." That word, kiddo, made something twist inside me. I wanted to yell that he wasn't allowed to call me that, but for the first time I didn't. I just stood there and stared at the man who was breaking himself to keep us together. Mom got better. Life went on. But something in me shifted. I still called him Tom, but I stopped slamming doors when he spoke. Sometimes I'd even ask for help, like when the car wouldn't start, or when I needed a ride to a late study group. He never said, "I told you so." He'd just grab his keys and say, "Let's go." College came, and I got a scholarship out of state. Mom cried the night before I left. Tom just helped load my boxes into his truck, quiet as always. When I hugged Mom goodbye, he stood a few feet back, hands in his pockets. I could see he wanted to say something, but didn't, so I said, "Thanks for the ride." He smiled, a small, crooked smile. "Anytime." As I walked toward the bus station, I glanced back once. He was still standing there beside the truck, watching until I was out of sight. I didn't wave. I should have. Years passed faster than I expected. College, job, city life. The kind of life where you forget to call home until one day you realize the house number doesn't feel like yours anymore. I'd visit occasionally. Tom had more gray in his hair each time, and Mom's laugh lines had deepened. They'd sit together on the porch swing, holding hands like newlyweds. Every visit, Tom would ask about my work, my apartment, my car. I'd answer politely, never warmly. There was always that invisible wall, the one I'd built and refused to tear down. Then came the winter that changed everything. Mom called one night, her voice trembling. "Sweetheart, Tom's not doing well." My heart froze. "What do you mean?" "He collapsed at work. The doctors say it's his heart." I was on the next flight home. The drive from the airport to the hospital felt endless. Snow fell like ashes on the road, and every mile I wished I could go back, not just in distance, but in time. When I walked into the hospital room, I almost didn't recognize him. The strong man who once carried boxes and built fences now lay pale and frail, tubes running from his arms. Mom was asleep in the chair beside him. He opened his eyes slowly and smiled weakly. "Hey, kiddo." That word again. After all the years, after all the distance, he still said it the same way. Gentle, like it never hurt him when I ignored it. I tried to smile, but my voice broke. "Hey, how are you feeling?" He chuckled softly. "Like I got hit by my own truck." I laughed through tears, and for the first time in years, I sat beside him. Not out of guilt, but out of something real. He looked at me carefully, his hand trembling as he reached for mine. "You grew up good, you know that?" "Because of Mom," I said automatically. He shook his head slowly. "Because of both of us." That was the first time I didn't pull my hand away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the hospital hallway, watching snowflakes melt against the window. All I could think about was how I had spent a lifetime punishing a man who never stopped loving me. I realized something cruel. I had never once said thank you. Not once. So when the nurse told me he was awake again just before dawn, I ran to his room. The monitors beeped softly, the morning light pale against the white walls. He looked at me, tired but peaceful. "Hey, you okay?" And that's when I whispered, "I'm sorry, Tom." He smiled weakly. "For what?" "For never calling you what you are." He blinked slowly. "And what's that?" I took his hand, tears spilling down my cheeks. "My dad." He closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his face. "Took you long enough, kiddo." The machines hummed, the morning sun rose, and in that quiet moment, for the first time in my life, I felt like I had a father. I don't remember the sound the heart monitor made when it stopped. Maybe I didn't want to. Maybe my mind erased it the same way you try to erase pain from a memory that refuses to fade. All I remember is the stillness. The kind that swallows you whole. Mom was asleep in the chair when the nurse came in. She woke up with a gasp and the world became a blur of voices, movement, tears. Someone pulled me aside, but I couldn't move. I just stared at his hand, still warm, still strong-looking, even as life slipped away. I held it until the nurse whispered, "We have to." I shook my head. Just one more minute, one more minute. That's what I kept asking for, but the truth was, I'd already had 20 years of them, and I wasted most pretending I didn't care. The funeral was 3 days later. It rained, the way it does in movies, as if the sky itself was mourning. People from his work came, some neighbors, a few relatives I barely knew. Everyone had a story about him. They said things like, "Tom was the kindest man I knew," or "He'd give his last dollar to help someone else." Each story was another knife twisting inside me. I had lived with him for years and never really knew the man they were talking about. When it was my turn to speak, I stood there in front of the coffin, hands shaking, my throat dry. Mom was crying quietly in the front row. I opened my mouth, but no words came. What could I possibly say? That I'd hated him for trying to love me? That I'd built walls he never stopped knocking on? Finally, I whispered, "He never asked for anything, but gave everything." And then I walked away. After the service, people hugged me, said sorry, said he'd be proud of me. But pride didn't matter anymore. The house felt different now. Too quiet, too clean, too empty. His boots were still by the door. His jacket hung on the chair like he'd just come home from work. Mom couldn't bear to move anything. She'd sit on the couch every evening, eyes lost somewhere far away. One night, about a week after the funeral, she handed me an envelope. It was folded neatly, my name written in his handwriting. Block letters, steady, familiar? Found this in his desk, she said softly. It's for you. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small old photo. Me, maybe 10 years old, sitting on his shoulders at a fair. I didn't even remember that day. The letter began simply, "Hey, kiddo." I had to stop reading for a moment because that word, kiddo, broke something open in me. I took a deep breath and continued. If you're reading this, it means I've probably gone on ahead. I want you to know that being your dad, even if you never called me that, was the best thing I ever did. You made me laugh, made me proud, made me patient, and yeah, sometimes made me crazy. But I wouldn't trade a single moment. I know you always missed your real father. I tried not to take it personally. I figured, maybe, love is something you have to grow into. You don't owe me anything, kiddo. Not a name, not an apology. Just promise me you'll live a big life, one that makes you smile when you wake up. Fix things when they break, even if they're not yours to fix. That's something I learned too late in my own life, and every once in a while, eat some bad spaghetti and laugh for me. Love always, Tom. By the time I finished, the page was wet with tears. It wasn't fancy or poetic. It was simple like him. Honest, quiet, full of heart. I read it again and again, until I could almost hear his voice saying the words. The next morning, I found myself sitting in his truck, the old blue one that still smelled faintly like pine and oil. The keys were in the ignition. I turned it on. The engine coughed to life, the radio humming softly with static before settling on an old country song. It felt like he was there. I drove aimlessly through the small Ohio streets I hadn't seen in years. Every turn, every corner carried a memory I had ignored. The grocery store where he used to buy me chocolate milk after school. The auto shop, where he spent half his life fixing other people's problems. The park where we once sat in silence. After my first heartbreak, I stopped by the lake at the edge of town and the one we used to visit. When Mom needed space, I remembered being 13, sitting on a rock while he fished quietly beside me. I had asked him once, "Why do you like fishing?" "It's boring," he had smiled. "Because it teaches you to wait. Good things don't come when you demand them. They come when you're ready." Now, years later, I finally understood. I stayed by that lake until the sun dipped below the trees. The sky turned orange, then violet, and I whispered into the fading light, I was ready. Dad, just too late. The wind picked up gently, and I swear for a second I heard his laugh in the breeze, soft, forgiving. When I got back home, Mom was sitting by the fireplace. She smiled faintly when she saw me holding the letter. "You read it," she said. I nodded. "Yeah," she touched my cheek gently. "He loved you more than you'll ever know." "I know," I whispered. "Now I do." The weeks that followed were quiet but healing. I started helping Mom with things around the house, fixing small stuff, painting, even mowing the lawn. One afternoon, while cleaning the garage, I found a dusty wooden box. Inside were old tools, a few photos, and a half-finished piece of wood shaped like a bird. On a sticky note attached, he had written, "Teach her this one day." I smiled through tears. I spent the next few hours finishing it, sanding the edges, painting it sky blue, his favorite color. When I showed it to Mom, she cried. "He was making that for you when you got your first apartment." I didn't know what to say. So I just held her hand and whispered, "He still gave it to me." That night, I hung the little blue bird by the window. It catches the morning light now, every sunrise casting its shadow across the room. Sometimes, when I wake up, I swear I hear that faint sound of a screwdriver turning in the quiet. The same sound from years ago when he was fixing that squeaky cabinet, trying to make a home out of our chaos. It doesn't annoy me anymore. Now it feels like love. It's been 2 years since he passed. I still visit his grave once a month. I bring fresh flowers, daisies, his favorite. I sit and talk to him like he's sitting right there beside me. Sometimes I tell him about work, sometimes about Mom, and sometimes I just sit in silence. There's comfort in that silence now, the kind only love can leave behind. A few weeks ago, I got offered a job back in town, teaching at the local school. Mom said, "He'd be so proud." And for once, I didn't doubt it, because even though he's gone, I feel him everywhere, in the creak of the porch swing, the smell of old leather, the laughter that sneaks up when I least expect it. I still call him Dad now. Not out loud, but in my heart, every single day. The first day I walked into the classroom, the smell of chalk and old wood brought me back to childhood, back to a time when I thought I knew everything and listened to no one. Now, I stood on the other side of the desk, facing 20 pairs of curious eyes. Some nervous, some excited, some just tired from waking up too early. "Good morning," I said with a small smile. "I'm Ms. Carter. I'll be your English teacher this year." It felt strange saying that. Teacher. It was a title that once sounded so distant, so responsible. But now, as I looked at those kids, something in me softened. Teaching wasn't part of the plan. It just happened. A position opened. Mom encouraged me. And before I knew it, I was standing here, trying not to let my nerves show. The first few weeks were awkward. The kids tested me, talked over me, forgot their homework. But then there was one student, a quiet boy named Ethan, who reminded me so much of myself that it was almost painful. He sat in the back, always alone, sketching in the margins of his notebook instead of writing. When I asked him questions, he'd shrug or mutter something under his breath. One afternoon, after class, I caught him stuffing his bag too quickly. His notebook slipped and fell open. Inside were pages of drawings, trees, cars, animals, all detailed, alive. "These are really good," I said softly. He froze, like he wasn't used to hearing that. "They're just doodles." I smiled. Tom used to say that's how artists start, with doodles. He frowned. "Who's Tom?" I hesitated, then said quietly, "Someone who taught me more than any book ever could." Over the next few weeks, Ethan began staying after class. Sometimes we'd just talk. Sometimes he'd draw while I graded papers. He mentioned his stepfather once, briefly, saying, "He doesn't really get me." That hit like a stone in my chest. I knew that feeling too well. I wanted to tell him that one day he might look back and see everything differently, but I also knew that words like that don't mean much until you've lived them. So instead I said, "Give him time. People show love in strange ways." He shrugged, unconvinced, but he didn't argue. At home, Mom was doing better. She had joined a book club, started baking again, even laughed more. Every time she smiled, I could see a little bit of him in her. The patience, the humor, the quiet strength. One evening, as I was grading papers at the kitchen table, she placed a mug of tea beside me. "You know," she said, "Tom would have loved seeing you teach. He always said you'd be good with kids." I looked up, surprised. "He said that?" "All the time," she said, smiling faintly. "Even when you were little, he'd say, 'That girl has a fire in her. She just needs to point it the right way.'" For a second, I couldn't speak. The lump in my throat made it impossible. It felt like he was still guiding me somehow. Through her words, through my students, through everything I was doing. A few months later, Ethan stopped coming to class. At first, I thought he was sick, but when a week passed, I started to worry. I called the school counselor, who told me in a low voice, "His mother's been ill. His stepdad's working 2 jobs to keep things together." Something in me stirred, that old ache of misunderstanding, of distance between hearts trying to reach each other. After school, I drove to the address listed in his file, a small house at the end of a quiet street. I hesitated before knocking, wondering if I was crossing a line. But before I could change my mind, the door opened. Ethan's stepfather stood there, tall, exhausted, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. "Yes?" he asked cautiously. "Hi, I'm Ms. Carter, Ethan's teacher. I just wanted to check in. He hasn't been in class." He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Yeah, things have been rough. His mom's in the hospital again. I'm trying to keep up, but he's angry. Thinks I don't care." He looked down, and I could see it. That quiet pain, that helplessness I'd once seen in Tom's eyes when I used to shut him out. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "If it helps, he's a good kid. He just needs to know someone's in his corner." The man nodded, his voice breaking slightly. I'm trying. I really am. I know, I whispered. Just don't stop showing up. Even when he pushes you away. He looked at me strangely, then smiled. The kind of smile that's half gratitude, half exhaustion. I'll try. When I left, I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. I thought about Tom again, how many times he must have stood outside my door, wanting to talk, and turned away when I wouldn't listen. And suddenly I understood the strength it took to love someone who didn't want you to. It wasn't weakness, it was the purest kind of courage. Ethan came back to class a week later. He didn't say much, but when I handed him his missed assignments, he muttered, "Thanks." And then just before leaving, he said quietly, "He's trying, you know, my stepdad. I think I was wrong about him." I smiled. It's okay to be wrong sometimes. That's how we grow. He gave a shy smile back and hurried out the door. And I sat there for a long time, heart full, realizing that maybe this connection, this passing on of understanding, was Tom's way of living on through me. That spring, the school organized a family event. Parents were invited to see their kids' projects, and the walls were lined with drawings, essays, and crafts. Ethan had drawn something special, a picture of a man fixing a birdhouse while a little boy watched. At the bottom, he'd written, "Not all heroes wear capes, some just hold the ladder." When his stepdad saw it, he wiped his eyes and put a hand on Ethan's shoulder. I had to turn away to keep from crying. That night, I visited Tom's grave again. The sky was clear, stars scattered across the dark like tiny promises. I knelt down, brushing a leaf off his headstone. "Hey," I whispered. "Guess what? I think I'm finally doing something right." I told him about Ethan, about Mom, about the class, about how life felt lighter now, not because the pain was gone, but because it had finally found purpose. I used to think love had to be perfect, I said quietly. But now I know, it just has to stay. The wind moved softly through the trees, and a single bluebird landed nearby, pecking at the grass. I smiled through tears. "You sent that, didn't you?" I sat there until the air grew cold and the world went still again. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like home. It's strange how time moves after loss. Some days, it drifts quietly, like the gentle hum of a song you can barely hear. Other days, it crashes over you in waves, reminding you that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning to carry the memories differently. Spring turned into summer before I realized it. The air smelled like freshly cut grass, and the town started to come alive again. Fairs, parades, kids riding bikes down Main Street. Life was moving on, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid to move with it. Teaching had become more than just a job. It was a kind of therapy, a daily reminder that we all have second chances, even if they don't look the way we expect. The laughter of my students, the scribbled essays full of mistakes and dreams, they filled the spaces Tom once occupied in silence. And in some strange, beautiful way, it felt like I was still talking to him through every lesson I taught. One afternoon, after school, I stayed late grading essays. The janitor was mopping the hallway, the sound echoing softly through the empty building. As I flipped through papers, one of Ethan's essays caught my eye. The title read, "The Man Who Stayed." I smiled and started reading. Sometimes people leave, but sometimes someone comes into your life and decides to stay. My stepdad isn't my real dad, but he's real in every other way that matters. He fixes the car, burns the pancakes, tells bad jokes, and listens even when I pretend I don't care. I used to hate him. But now I see, maybe love doesn't always start with blood, maybe it starts with patience. By the end, tears blurred the words. It wasn't just Ethan's story. It was mine too, the one I'd been too late to write. Driving home that evening, I rolled the windows down, letting the warm wind tangle my hair. I passed the old hardware store where Tom used to buy tools, the diner where we'd sit on Sundays. Everywhere I looked, pieces of him still lingered, not as pain anymore, but as gentle reminders that love, once given, never really leaves. When I got home, Mom was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea. She looked peaceful, like the years had finally softened their hold on her. "Long day?" she asked. I smiled, sitting beside her. "Good day," she nodded. "You know, I dreamed about him last night." "He was fixing the fence again." I laughed softly. "Of course he was. He looked happy," she said. "Told me you're doing exactly what you're meant to." For a moment, I just stared at the fading sunset. "Maybe he's right," I whispered. Mom reached over and squeezed my hand. He usually was. A few weeks later, I was offered a promotion, head of the English department. It wasn't something I'd planned, but I could almost hear Tom's voice in my head saying, "When life hands you a wrench, kiddo, don't drop it. Learn how to use it." So I said yes. The first day in my new office, I found myself rearranging the desk, setting up my books and pens. It felt too neat, too empty. So I reached into my bag and pulled out the photo, the one of Tom carrying me on his shoulders. I placed it by the lamp. It belonged there. Every time I looked at it, I felt grounded, like he was still watching, still cheering me on quietly from wherever he was. It was around that time I met Daniel. He was a history teacher, new in town with kind eyes and a habit of over-explaining everything. He was gentle, funny in that dry kind of way, and always asked questions like he actually cared about the answers. At first, I kept my distance. I wasn't ready. My heart still felt like it belonged partly to the past, to all the words I never said and the love I'd only recently learned to understand. But Daniel didn't rush me. He just showed up. Small gestures, simple conversations, patience that reminded me of Tom in a way that both comforted and terrified me. One afternoon, as we were walking to the parking lot, he said, "You talk about your stepdad a lot." I smiled faintly. "I guess I do." "You must have loved him." "I didn't. Not when he was alive." "I thought I did sometimes, but mostly I was just angry." Daniel looked at me quietly, the kind of silence that doesn't demand more, but allows it. I took a breath. "I didn't call him Dad until I couldn't anymore," he nodded. "Sometimes we only realize the shape of love when it's gone." "Yeah," I said softly, "but sometimes it still finds a way back." That night, I couldn't sleep. I went out to the porch and looked up at the stars, their quiet shimmer stretching across the dark. I thought about Tom again, about all the nights he'd waited up for me when I was out too late, all the mornings he'd left coffee on the table even when I ignored him. Love had always been there, steady and unspoken. Now I was finally learning how to live it, not just feel it. I whispered into the night, "You'd like him, Tom. He's patient. Like you." The wind moved softly through the trees, as if in answer. The next few months passed in a rhythm that felt almost peaceful. Teaching, laughter, late-night grading, coffee with Daniel, and quiet weekends with Mom. But one afternoon, I received a letter in the mail, from the nursing home where Tom's older sister, Aunt May, had lived. She'd passed away recently, and among her things, they found a small envelope addressed to me. Inside was a key and a note written in her shaky handwriting. "Tom kept this for you. Said you'd know what to do with it one day. No explanation. No address. Just the key." My hands trembled slightly as I showed it to Mom. She gasped softly. "That's the key to the cabin." "What cabin?" "The one he bought years ago, up by Silver Lake. He used to go there to fix things, to think. Said he was saving it for something special. We hadn't been there since I was a kid. Something inside me stirred, that same pull I'd felt the day I found his letter. I think it's time to go," I said quietly. The next weekend, I drove up to Silver Lake. The road curved through fields of wildflowers and pine trees until it opened up to a small clearing. The cabin stood there, weathered but strong, sunlight glinting off its old windows. I unlocked the door, and the air inside smelled faintly of cedar and dust. There were old tools on the table, a fishing rod in the corner, and a faded flannel jacket hanging by the door. Everything was exactly how he'd left it. I walked through slowly, touching the worn wood, the chipped mugs, the framed photo of Mom and me sitting by the lake years ago. It was like stepping into a memory that had been waiting patiently for me to return. On the desk, I found another envelope, this one smaller, older. The edges yellowed with time. My name was written on it again. Inside was a note, written in his steady handwriting. for when you're ready to build something of your own. Beneath it was a blueprint, a small design for a porch swing. I sank into the old chair, the paper shaking in my hands as tears fell silently onto the page. He'd left me one last lesson, not just words this time, but a plan, a way to create, to keep building even when everything else falls apart. That evening, I sat by the lake with the blueprint beside me. The sun dipped low, turning the water gold. I could almost see him there, sitting beside me, smiling that quiet smile. "I'm still learning," I whispered, "but I'm getting there." A single bird flew across the horizon, blue against orange, and I knew it wasn't just coincidence. Sometimes, the people we lose never really leave us. They live on in the way we speak, the choices we make, the love we give to others, and in that moment, I finally understood what he meant in his letter, that love isn't about being called dad. It's about showing up, again and again, even when no one notices. I looked down at the blueprint, then back at the lake and smiled. Tomorrow, I'd start building the swing. The first hammer strike echoed across the still morning air, sharp and clean. The smell of sawdust and pine filled the cabin yard as I worked, clumsy at first, then steadier. The porch swing blueprint lay open beside me, creased and worn from all the times I'd unfolded it, just to trace my fingers along the lines he'd drawn. Tom had always built things with quiet patience, fixing fences, carving shelves, mending what others would have thrown away. And now, here I was doing the same. Every nail I drove in, every board I sanded, felt like stitching time back together. Like maybe this was the conversation we never had, told not with words, but with wood and wire, silence and wind. By the second day, I'd settled into a rhythm: hammer, breath, sand, tighten. The lake shimmered in the distance, sunlight glinting off ripples like tiny moving stars. I remembered the summers we'd spent here. Me sulking, refusing to fish, claiming I was too old for his silly bonding time. He'd never forced me, just sat quietly by the water, waiting. Now as I built the swing alone, I finally understood what that silence had meant. Love waiting without demand. That afternoon, Mom arrived. I heard her car crunching up the dirt road, and when she stepped out, she looked around like she was seeing ghosts. "I can't believe it's still standing," she murmured, brushing her fingers along the doorframe. "He built it well," I said. "Like everything else," she smiled faintly. "He always said good things take time." Inside, we made tea, the same way he used to, too strong and too hot. We sat on the floor surrounded by old photo albums I'd found in a trunk. There were pictures I'd never seen. Him holding me at a school play, watching from the back row, sitting beside Mom during Christmas when I was probably upstairs on my phone. Too busy to notice? Mom's voice was soft. "He loved you, you know. Even when you pushed him away," I nodded slowly. "I know that now. I just wish I'd said it back sooner." She reached over, touched my hand. "You're saying it now, sweetheart. That's what matters." That night, I sat outside alone again. The stars shimmered above, the lake whispering below. I looked at the half-finished swing and smiled. "Almost done, Tom," I whispered. Somewhere deep inside, I felt a warmth. Not sadness this time, but something gentler. Peace. The next morning, I woke early and finished the final touches. When I stepped back and looked at the swing, it wasn't perfect. The boards were uneven. One side leaned a little lower, but it was real. It was ours. I sat down slowly, letting the wood creak beneath me. The chains groaned softly, then steadied, and as I swayed gently back and forth, the view of the lake opened wide before me, endless, calm, alive. For a moment, I closed my eyes and imagined him there, sitting beside me, his calloused hand gripping the chain, smiling that quiet, proud smile he always had when he didn't want to show emotion. "You did good. Kiddo," I could almost hear him say. I laughed softly through the tears. "Took me long enough." Later that afternoon, Daniel drove up. He stepped out of his car looking a little nervous, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You really built that?" he said, eyes wide. "Mostly," I smiled. "It's crooked, but it swings." He sat down beside me and we rocked gently together. The sound of the lake lapping against the shore filled the silence between us. After a while, he spoke. "You talk about him like he's still here." I nodded. He kind of is. In small ways, Daniel smiled softly. Then I hope he knows you turned out okay. I looked at him, then out over the water. Yeah, I said quietly. I think he does. We stayed there for hours, talking about everything and nothing, and somewhere between the laughter and the pauses, I realized I wasn't just remembering anymore. I was living again. That night, before heading back inside, I carved something small into the bottom of the swing with Tom's old pocket knife. 4 simple words, built with your love. Months passed. Seasons turned. I kept returning to the cabin, fixing small things, teaching during the week, driving up on weekends. It became my quiet ritual. A way to stay connected, to keep learning the language of peace. Mom visited often too. She'd bring flowers for the porch, sit in the swing, and talk about Tom like he'd just gone to the store. The pain had softened into stories, the kind you tell with a smile instead of tears. One autumn evening, after school, I received a package at my apartment. It had no return address, just my name written neatly. Inside was a small wooden box. When I opened it, I froze. It was the keychain I'd given Tom when I was 14, the one that said, "World's okayest stepdad." Back then, I'd given it to him as a joke, half sarcastic, half sincere. He'd laughed and used it anyway. Now here it was again, worn. The engraving faded, and underneath it was a small note, written in Aunt May's handwriting. He kept it until the end, said it was his favorite gift. Tears fell silently as I held the keychain in my palm. It wasn't fancy, wasn't expensive, but it was proof. Proof that love had existed quietly, steadfastly, all along. That weekend, I went back to the cabin. The air was crisp, the lake still, leaves turning gold. I sat on the swing, the keychain in my hand, and whispered, "Thank you." The wind rustled the trees gently, as if answering back. I stayed there until sunset, watching the light fade across the water, thinking about everything we'd built, the bridges, the silences, the forgiveness that had finally found its way home. Months later, Daniel proposed. It was simple. No grand gestures, no crowd, just the 2 of us on the porch swing, the lake behind us. The same gentle quiet that had once been filled with grief now holding something softer. When he asked, I said yes, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of wholeness, not because I was moving on, but because I was carrying everything forward. On our wedding day, Mom gave me a small wrapped box before I walked down the aisle. Inside was a silver bracelet, simple, engraved with 3 words. For Tom. She smiled through her tears. He'd want to be here. In some way, I think he is. I wore it as I walked, and when I looked up at the sky, I could almost feel him there. Quiet, proud, steady as ever. A few months later, Daniel and I moved to the cabin permanently. We fixed the roof, repainted the porch, planted flowers out front, and every evening, we'd sit on the swing, the same one I'd built, watching the lake shimmer under the fading light. Sometimes we'd talk about the future, sometimes about the past, and sometimes we'd just sit there in silence, the kind of silence that feels full, not empty. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I whispered softly, "You know, I never really said goodbye to him." Daniel looked at me gently. Maybe you didn't have to, and maybe he was right. Because goodbye isn't always the end. Sometimes it's just another word for thank you. As night fell, I stood up, walked to the edge of the lake, and threw the keychain into the water. It sank slowly, catching the last glint of sunlight before disappearing beneath the surface. "I love you, Tom," I whispered. Always did. Just took me a while to realize it. The water rippled once, then stilled, and for the first time in a long time, I felt light. Not from letting go, but from finally understanding that I never had to. The morning air smelled of rain and fresh grass as I stood on the porch, coffee mug warm between my palms. The lake shimmered in the distance, quiet and familiar, like an old friend who'd never left. Years had passed since Tom's funeral, but his presence lingered in every creak of the cabin floor, every sigh of wind through the pine trees. The swing still stood strong, chains rusted slightly, wood worn smooth from countless evenings of thought and conversation. It had become more than a swing. It was a monument of sorts, a heartbeat in wood and steel. Inside, a small voice called out, "Mommy, can I come outside?" I turned, smiling. "Of course, sweetheart. Put your jacket on." A moment later, Lily ran out, her little boots clattering on the porch. She was 5 now, curious, bold, endlessly full of life. Her hair caught the sunlight, golden like the leaves that danced around us. She climbed up onto the swing beside me, clutching a stuffed bear in one hand. "Push me, Mommy." I laughed softly. "All right, hold tight." The chain squeaked as I gave her a gentle push. She giggled, the sound bright and pure, echoing across the yard. As she swung back toward me, her laughter melted into the sound of the lake, and for a moment, I could almost see another pair of hands pushing me. "Years ago, patient and steady, higher," she squealed. "Not too high," I said, smiling. "You'll fly away," she laughed harder. "Maybe I'll fly to Grandpa Tom." I froze for a second. She'd never met him, but she knew his name, from the stories I told her every night. He was her invisible guardian, her bedtime legend. To her, Tom wasn't a shadow of the past. He was the invisible thread that held our family together. "Maybe you will," I said softly. "And if you do, tell him I said thank you." She nodded with solemn importance, like she truly believed she could. "Okay, Mommy." That afternoon, Daniel came home from work. He was carrying a small wooden box in his hands. "What's that?" I asked. He smiled. "A little something I made for Lily's room." He opened the lid. Inside was a tiny carved model of the cabin, complete with miniature swing and lake. The craftsmanship was beautiful, delicate, detailed, full of care. I ran my fingers along the edge, my chest tightening with emotion. "It's perfect," I whispered. He looked at me knowingly. "I used Tom's old toolbox, the one you kept in the shed." For a moment, I couldn't speak. It was as if the past had reached out, lending its strength to the present. "Thank you," I finally said, voice thick. He smiled, pulling me close. "He built this life. We're just keeping it alive." That night, after tucking Lily in, I sat on the porch swing again. The stars scattered above like quiet witnesses. The moon reflected off the lake, painting ripples of silver light across the water. I remembered the first time I'd sat here alone, broken and angry, hammering wood just to fill the silence. Now, the silence was peaceful, full of meaning, not emptiness. I looked down at my hands, older, steadier, still calloused from years of teaching and building. Maybe I had a little of him in me after all. The next morning, Lily and I went into town to buy supplies for her school project, Family Heroes. When we came back home, she sat at the kitchen table, crayons scattered everywhere, her tongue poking out in concentration as she drew. After a while, she held up her paper proudly. "Look, Mommy, my family." I smiled, expecting to see the usual trio, her, Daniel, and me. But my breath caught when I saw what she'd drawn. There were 4 figures, a woman with long hair, a man with brown hair and glasses, Daniel, a little girl with yellow hair, Lily, and beside them, slightly faded in the background, a man with gray hair and kind eyes. "That's Grandpa Tom," she said simply, pointing. "He's in heaven, but he's still with us." Tears welled in my eyes. "That's beautiful, honey," she beamed proudly. "He helps me when I'm scared at night. You said he used to make you feel safe, so I think he makes me feel safe too." I pulled her into a hug, unable to speak. Children had a way of seeing truth without needing proof. That weekend, we visited the small-town cemetery. Lily carried a bundle of wildflowers she'd picked from the yard. We stopped at Tom's grave. Simple, humble, just like he'd lived. Lily crouched down, placing the flowers neatly at the base of the stone. "Hi, Grandpa Tom," she said softly. "I drew you today." I stood beside her, heart swelling and breaking all at once. After a moment, she looked up at me. "Mommy, did you love him a lot?" I nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, I did. More than I ever said. Then I think he knows," she whispered. "Because love doesn't stop, right?" I smiled through tears. "Right, my love. It never stops." As we drove back, I felt something shift inside me. Not the weight of grief, that had softened long ago, but the warmth of peace. For years, I'd carried the ache of things unsaid, the regret of missed chances. But now, watching my daughter hum in the back seat, holding her stuffed bear. I realized something profound. Love never dies. It just changes hands. Tom's love had become mine. And now mine had become hers. That was the legacy. Quiet, simple, eternal. Weeks later, on a breezy Sunday morning, Daniel was fixing the fence when I joined him outside. He smiled. Looks like rain again. I looked at the sky, gray clouds rolling in, wind tugging at the leaves. It's okay, I said, smiling. The swing could use a wash. We laughed softly, side by side, our hands brushing as we worked, and when the first raindrop fell, I felt it. Not sadness, but a reminder. Tom had always loved the rain. Said it was nature's way of cleansing old wounds. As the drizzle turned into a gentle shower, I tilted my head up, letting it soak my face. Daniel looked at me, amused. You're going to catch a cold. I smiled through the droplets. Maybe, but it feels like he's saying hello. That evening, after the rain passed, the world smelled new again. Fresh earth, wet pine. The kind of scent that carries memory. I sat on the swing with Lily in my lap, watching the sunset streak the sky in gold and violet. She pointed at the clouds. Look, Mommy, that one looks like Grandpa Tom's hat. I laughed softly. You think so? She nodded seriously. He's watching us. I just know it. And maybe she was right. Because as the wind stirred gently, the swing moved on its own, slow, steady, like an invisible hand pushing it forward. The chains creaked softly, in rhythm with the heartbeat of the evening. I smiled, tears glimmering. Hi, Tom, I whispered. We're okay. The swing rocked once more. Slow and certain, and somewhere deep in the quiet hum of dusk, I felt it. That familiar warmth, the same unspoken love that had raised me, healed me, and built everything I now had. Years later, when Lily was grown, she'd inherit the cabin. Maybe she'd bring her children there someday, and they'd run through the same yard, touch the same trees, sit on the same swing, and maybe she'd tell them in her own way about the man who wasn't born into our family but built it with his hands, because legacies aren't written in stone. They're carved into hearts, passed down in stories, carried in laughter and memory. And even when the lights go out, love, real love, always finds a way to stay.